I want to introduce you to Judith Roales. Judith was inducted into the Delaware Hall of Fame in April of 2014. She earned the honor for her research and photo documentation of Delaware's lighthouses and range lights. That research led to her writing a series of lighthouse books, which include information about lighthouse technology, construction techniques, Fresnel lenses, stories about local keepers, and commentary on the status of the Delaware lights. Her presentations, articles, and books inspired Delaware's Lighthouse Trail, which guides interested visitors to the state's existing lighthouses, sites of former lighthouses, and the location of lighthouse artifacts. A longtime president of the Delaware River and Bay Lighthouse Foundation, she helped the foundation become a well-organized, financially sound, prominent entity devoted to educating about and promoting Delaware's maritime history. She developed the historic materials and displays inside the East End and harbor of Refuge lighthouses and opened the Delaware East End Lighthouse for public tours. She made presentations throughout Delaware to schools, senior centers, historic societies, and other organizations regarding the history and plight of the harbor of Refuge Lighthouse. Her fundraising efforts helped secure over $3 million for the stabilization and repair of the National Harbor Refuge water break. In addition, Roales prepared detailed documentation of the wall's original construction materials and its repairs, which she documented in a book. The original documentation and the book were both donated to the Lewes Historical Society as a permanent record of the wall's history. Through her innovative leadership, the foundation created the Lighthouse Festival at Lewes Ferry Terminal and helped the city of Lewes develop the Lewes Maritime History Trail. Her efforts have helped preserve Delaware lighthouses. Roales first became interested in lighthouses in 1964 as part of her actual job. As a national award-winning newspaper reporter and executive, she retired in 2000 as a publisher of the St. Petersburg Times of Florida. Please give Judith Roales a welcome, a warm shellback welcome. All yours, Judith.
Hello, all. Okay, I'm very happy to be here and glad to see so many of you. And Diane, I really appreciated that touching salute to Remembrance Day. I actually was in Australia on Remembrance Day several years ago and visited the new museum at the town, and I can't remember the name of the town, where the soldiers actually gathered and left for Gallipoli. And it's a very touching place. If any of you happen to have the opportunity to go there, I highly recommend that museum. It's very touching, really one of the best I've ever seen. So now I'm going to try to make sure I get my slide presentation up. If you'll all just bear with me just a minute. All right, we're going to wing it without the notes. What we're going to talk about today is, I know when you think about lighthouses or when somebody mentions lighthouse in the United States that you don't normally think about Delaware. Little Delaware, the second smallest state in the United States, has a very small coastline and one of the smallest coastlines in the country. But it turns out that it also has one of the longest and oldest lighthouse histories in the country. And it has been instrumental in innovation and experimentation in the field of aids to navigation that led to a lot of safety in navigation that those of you who are sailors have all benefited from at one time or another. So I'm going to try and show you some lighthouses that were connected with those kinds of innovation. Now, when you think about going all the way back to the early 1700s, remember that the major transportation route in the United States was from New York to the Chesapeake Bay. And most of the supplies coming into Boston and New York travel down that route by ship in order to get elsewhere in the United States. That's 300 miles. And in those days, it was easily a week-long trip, and there's nowhere in between to stop. No lights, nothing. And this is a very difficult coast. Let me see if I can get a, can't even do that. All right. And it's a very difficult route because there's no inland harbor that is well marked and that you can get into easily. It's very shoaled, it's very rocky. And of course, at the top of the Delaware Bay, which is exactly halfway in along this route, is Philadelphia, which is a good 120 miles up from the ocean. So it was a very difficult route and badly in need of some kind of safe way to get around in the ocean and the bay. One of the first evidences we have of the early lighthouse history in Delaware is this is a raffle ticket that was sold by the merchants of Philadelphia in order to raise money to build the Cape Henlopen Lighthouse. I love this to counterfeit is death, it says on this ticket. So they were serious about making sure they got every bit of the money from any of these tickets that were sold. It was a normal raffle where, you know, the winner got part of the money and the rest of it went toward building the lighthouse. The lighthouse was the 6th lighthouse built by the colonies before there was a United States. The only one of those first 6 lighthouses that's still standing is the Sandy Hook Lighthouse in New Jersey. And it is no longer, it's still an active aid to navigation, but it's no longer owned by the federal government as a aid to navigation. The property is owned by the National Park Service and it's preserved as a public recreational spot. Cape Henlopen, as you can see here, was built in 1767, which was 9 years before the colonies became the United States. Do you have all of these these pieces of property on the top? Can I get rid of them? Wait a minute. I've got a bunch of labels that are showing up.
Not showing up on us.
Okay,
ours.
all right, then I didn't do any damage by getting rid of them.
No, we don't see them.
Okay, good. Delaware's first lighthouse was this Cape Henlopen Lighthouse, which it is just exactly what you think about when you think about the term lighthouse. It's a tall, white, slender building with the light sitting on top of it. It was built on a big sand hill, giving it quite a high focal plane so that it could be seen quite far out to sea. However, the problem here was that this great sand hill is what's now known as a walking dune. And it was walking even when they built this lighthouse, I guess, and it continued to walk for a good number of years. All of these first 6 lighthouses were ceded to the federal government by the colonies when the United States became a separate entity. And one of the first things that happened was good old Benjamin Franklin stood up and wrote a note to George Washington and said, George, you know, that lighthouse at Cape Henlopen is going to fall over. It's sitting on that sand hill and it's getting pushed toward the ocean every day and it's going to fall over. You better be ready for that. Well, it turns out that Ben Franklin was right in his predictions. You can see in these pictures how the dune is pushing from the back and the ocean is eroding away from the front, and the lighthouse is in a very precarious position. At this point in time, when this particular series of pictures were taken in the early 1920s, the lighthouse had actually already been condemned because of its precarious position, and a small beacon light had been built on the point of Cape Henlopen to replace it. So Ben Franklin's prediction was about to come true. However, it was about 150 years after he made it. On a quiet day in April, just a week or so before Easter, no hurricane, no storm, nice light breeze. The last few grains of sand that were holding that lighthouse up trickled down, and the lighthouse followed it right down onto the beach. People in town said they were walking their dog or talking to their neighbors and looking at the lighthouses, enjoying it in the spring, beautiful spring day. They glanced away to talk to a neighbor, and when they turned back, the lighthouse just wasn't there anymore. So it was never rebuilt because that beacon had already been built to replace it, while this lighthouse out on the far, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, good. Out on the far tip of Cape Henlopen, this is the Harbor of Refuge Lighthouse, and it was in just about ready to be lighted for the first time when the Cape Henlopen Lighthouse fell. The lighthouse back here is the Delaware Breakwater Lighthouse, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about both of them in just a minute. I like to show this picture because it demonstrates, here's the dune pushing behind here, here's the coast. This picture taken in the early 1920s, even normally when the lighthouse was built, the coastline would have been way out here. Now it's, now it's all the way back to here already. And in just the few years since the 1920s, the coastline is about where this black shaded area is. And it comes down here to the end and makes a hook out here and then doubles back like that. Quite different. There is absolutely nothing left of this site at all. It's all underwater. Delaware had one other ocean coastal light, and that's the Fenwick Island Lighthouse, which is about 20 miles away from Cape Henlopen to the south. It was built on solid ground quite a ways inland, so it wasn't in any danger of falling. It is also still standing. It's not an active aid to navigation anymore. It's owned by the state of Delaware. And in the summertime, it's open and you can look up into this tower, but it's not available for climbing anymore since it's in pretty precarious position. It's now the oldest standing lighthouse in Delaware, having surpassed Cape Henlopen's 160 years. It's now 162 years old. While we're down here in the vicinity of Cape Henlopen, let me mention one of the early developments in this that this lighthouse made. It was active in experimentation with new fuels for providing the light source. And it was burning whale oil light while the famous British Eddystone Lighthouse was still burning 6 tallow candles. The
Wow.
more pure light from the whale oil was brighter and could be seen farther, and combined with the high level of the focal plane at about 126 feet, this lighthouse reputedly could be seen for 5 miles out to sea. And in those days, 5 miles was a really long way. Another advancement in fuels was made at the Christiana River Lighthouse actually on the river up in northern Delaware, where the federal government hired William Costin to conduct experiments with rosin gas. Rosin is like a pitch, and they wanted to make gas as a fuel for the lights and make it right there at the lighthouse so that they didn't have to worry about transportation. They didn't have to rely on any suppliers. All of the keepers could be generating their own fuel. Costin's experiments, which powered this little beacon right here, were successful. Again, it was a far superior light, and this light being superior to the whale oil, so it was a real improvement. But and it was tried at a few other lighthouses, but there were accidents because the keepers didn't follow good safety procedures. And it was never really adopted on any wide scale because it was difficult and it was dangerous. And there was a lot of concern that keepers were going to end up blowing up the lighthouses instead of just lighting the lights.
Yeah.
There we go. One of the places where Delaware made a major, massive, I might say, contribution is in its two giant breakwaters. Tiny Delaware at the mouth of the bay has two of the largest breakwaters in the United States. The first breakwater built is a mile and a quarter long, and the second one is a mile and 3/4 long. Neither are attached to land anywhere. They're both out in the open ocean. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting this. The first breakwater in North America was the Delaware Breakwater, and it was constructed between the years of 1827 and 1899. So you can see it took them a really long time to build this breakwater using the technology of the day. It was known for several things, one of which is the fact that it was the first major public works project of the new government. And as such, it is the granddaddy of federal funding for all maritime projects in the United States. People looked to this breakwater as either a huge source of pride for the United States or as one of the biggest boondoggles ever to happen, where the federal government was literally pouring money into the river off of southern Delaware. But it did start a precedent of the federal government providing funding for these projects that exists to this day. Previously, a project like this, which clearly was a benefit to all shipping, everybody in the United States who got any kind of a product benefited from this breakwater because ships could gather behind it, as you see them here, and be safe from the storms and the ice flows that come down the Delaware Bay. But previously, it would have been the states of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey that had to pay for this themselves because they were the most directly affected by it. Big breakwaters require lighthouses to lead ships into the breakwater harbor for safety and also to keep ships from hitting the breakwater itself. This is the Strickland Lighthouse, which is on the Delaware Breakwater. It's named after William Strickland, who was the chief engineer in charge of building the breakwater. Kind of a funny little story about Strickland. He, by contract, was required to live in this house that was built on the breakwater for the superintendent of the construction activities. Strickland, however, lived in Philadelphia and he had a good life in Philadelphia. He was a very active social person. And he said, "Not me, fellas, I'm not living down there on that breakwater." He probably threw in a few choice words also. So he never occupied this house. And what it really served as was the first temporary light on the breakwater while the government was constructing the actual lighthouse, which you see here to the left of the picture. The really interesting thing about this lighthouse is this architectural feature of this great big archway. And there's a second one on the other half of the building that you don't see in the picture here. This wasn't just to give the keeper a comfortable little enclosed porch where he could sit out and enjoy the maritime scenery. It wasn't a storage area. It was there so that the giant waves that come down the Delaware Bay and the strong force of the currents and the winds in the bay would go through the lighthouse instead of hitting against the foundation and damaging the lighthouse itself. This lighthouse now looks like this. It was actually destroyed by the Coast Guard in about 2005 because, of course, it hadn't been in use for a long time and it was becoming a danger in itself. So they raised it, and this is all that's left of it. But while it was in service, the government determined that it was in the wrong place. It was in the middle of the breakwater, and that didn't help the ships that were coming in from the ocean and turning into the bay. It didn't give ships coming down the bay the correct directions for getting inside the harbor. So they built a second lighthouse on the east end of the breakwater, and this is the Delaware Breakwater East End Lighthouse. It's one of the very early cast iron plate lighthouses. The plates were manufactured on shore, shipped down, preformed, bent into these circular kinds of forms, shipped down to the breakwater and assembled right there on site. Whereas it took a couple of years to build the original breakwater lighthouse, it took 6 months to put this one together. And I'm sure you can all guess what this little building is right here. This lighthouse is still in existence. It's not an active aid to navigation anymore, but it's quite close to shore, even though it's on a breakwater. Silting in has created a lot more land in that area. And so it can be reached easily by catamarans and that sort of small, or not catamarans, anyway, the little tour boats that go into the canal. So it's open sometimes in the summer for tours. The second breakwater was constructed in just a few short years at the turn of the century. Before the original breakwater was even finished, it was insufficient to do the job for which it was built. It had silted in. The original 23-foot harbor had become an 11-foot deep harbor at the same time that ships were getting larger and larger. They drew more draft, they took up more space. So it just wasn't sufficient for the job that it needed to do. Even before it was finished, the government started construction of this outer breakwater, which is 3 miles out, right at the point where the Delaware Bay crashes into the Atlantic Ocean. This is probably the roughest piece of water anywhere within 100 miles. It's massively mean out there. What you see on this is the first lighthouse, or it's actually a building that was used to house the workers, but they did put a light up on top of it while they were building the breakwater. When it was finished, they let it sit for a year, absolutely nothing, so that it would settle and they would be sure that it was sturdy and strong. And then, just like our modern day highway projects, the Corps of Engineers who built this breakwater came back to the breakwater and started taking the end of it apart so that they could sink a new breakwater into the end of this huge, massive stone wall. The first breakwater, the first lighthouse that was built there was a wooden lighthouse. It has a wonderful concrete foundation and then this iron caisson basement, but the rest of this was wood. And as I just said, this is the meanest spot in the bay and the meanest spot on the coast anywhere close around. And the waves were known to dash the lantern room. They were that high. And there are all kinds, there's a wonderful book that talks about, that was written by one of the keepers in this lighthouse, that talks about how terrifying it was when those big waves bashed against the side of the lighthouse. I want you to pay attention particularly to this big fog bell that's right here, because the fog bell went with some parts of the lighthouse to become a new harbor of refuge when, after just 20 years of service, the wooden lighthouse was completely destroyed and unusable. So the government kept the concrete foundation, and the iron basement was in good shape, so they kept it. They added another course of flared iron sheets to make a flange sort of configuration that was supposed to repel the waves. The waves would hit that and be washed back into the sea. And then the rest of this new lighthouse was built also of cast iron, so it was quite sturdy. The cupola, also shaded in yellow here, from the old first lighthouse, and the original light and lens also came over to the new lighthouse. This is a good picture of those preformed cast iron plates that they're making the flange that was supposed to reflect the waves. So that first order, or that fourth order Fresnel lens and an oil vapor incandescent lamp providing the light for that lens came over from the old lighthouse. But then as technology and time went on, the lighthouse used an Aero Beacon, which is just exactly what it sounds like. It's one of the same kind of beacons that used to be at the end of airport runways to signal the planes for safe landing. The Aero Beacon used a light bulb, a 500-watt light bulb that's about 7 inches high right here as its light source. Now the lighthouse has a VRB lens. It's called a top hat lens, and it's solar powered. And look at the size of the light bulbs it has. Each of these tiny little light bulbs is 75 watts, and they're just about an inch high. Man, have we lost the picture? There we go. The Harbor of Refuge is still an active navigation, and it's owned by the Delaware River and Bay Lighthouse Foundation. In this country, in 2004, actually about 2002, legislation passed giving the Coast Guard the authority to get rid of lighthouses that it no longer wanted to take care of. Whether or not they wanted to keep the lights shining, if they didn't want to take care of the building, they could declare it excess property, and the National Park Service was put in charge of finding new homes for those properties. So they advertised them as available, and a state can ask to have them, a county, a city, or a nonprofit organization. There are high standards that you have to meet in order to acquire one of these. If no nonprofit entity or governmental entity is a taker, then they're offered for public sale. And when they go up for public sale, there are preservation criteria that are in the deed, but one of the big problems is there's no follow-up to this. And so a lot of the lighthouses which have been accessed and sold to the public are just falling into ruin. You have a similar system in Canada, and there are a lot of them overseas, so you may be very familiar with this situation. The Delaware River and Bay was one of the first foundations, a first group. There were 4 original lighthouses that were given to nonprofit organizations, and one of those 4 was the Delaware River and Bay Lighthouse Foundation. They have maintained this light against all kinds of odds. It's a very expensive proposition. It is now open for tours in the summer, and it's expensive to get there because it's not as close to land as it looks like in this picture. It's actually 3 miles out in very difficult seas, so you have to take one of these big industrial launches that are used to take supplies and crew out to the ships in the channel. Delaware is also known as the River of Ranges. Ranges, Delaware didn't have the first ranges in the world or even in the United States. Ranges had been used in the British Isles in the late 1800s, and even in the United States in the South, there were a few ranges, but none of them were in terribly important, difficult spots. They were just one range at a time. But the problem in Delaware was that the river, when the bay narrows down and becomes the river is extremely shallow, and it has a lot of shoals. It's very twisty. So it needed something better than just a map or a chart to get the pilots through safely to the ports of Wilmington, Trenton, and Philadelphia. You can see from this graphic, each of these lines is a range, and each of the different colors is a different range. This is just a picture. This is the Delaware Bay, is kind of begins right here. And so this is a picture of just the very early part of the Delaware River, and there are already 7 or 8 ranges in here. I'm sure as sailors, most of you know what a range is. It's just kind of a safe path of light that gets you where you're going. And it has 2 lighthouses on it. It has a front light, which is usually much smaller than the one shown here even, and it's right down at the edge of the water. And then it has a rear light, which is much farther inland and is taller. The range works by having the pilot sight on the first light that it sees, which will be the front light, and then maneuver the ship until the rear light is lined up directly over the front light. And when the 2 lights are in that position, the ship is in the middle of the channel that will take them safely through shallow waters. And they just keep on that path of light until it starts to disintegrate, at which time they'll be able to see the front light for the next range. And they just repeat the process all over again and navigate their ship to line up 2 more lights, one on top of the other, and thus follow the lights all the way up to and beyond the city of Philadelphia. The first range in the Delaware River was the Newcastle range. And this is the Newcastle front lighthouse. I love this little lighthouse. I especially love this really ornate finial on top of it. Otherwise, kind of a utilitarian, little 10 by 10 wooden building. The light was originally shown out of this bay window on the first floor. Then as the shoreline got cluttered with trees and growth and maybe a few buildings, the light was moved up and shown behind this window on the second floor. And eventually, when a stronger light was needed, they got another one of those locomotive lights and put it out here on the outside of the lighthouse. This is the rear light to the Newcastle range. As you can see, it's a good bit higher than the front light. In addition to sitting farther back inland and on a hill, it's 5 stories high, with the light being seen out of the lantern room up here on the very top. Newcastle Range was active for 75 years, and then this rear light was destroyed by fire, which was the end of most of the wooden lighthouses in Delaware. Fires were quite common. The front light looks like this. Big disappointment now to just have this angle iron tower. It's in a industrial zone, and this is another one of these beautiful angle iron towers that is the rear light now. The only original part of this range that's left is this stone marker that marked the corner, one corner of the property. The range itself is still active, but there's nothing to show for the early lighthouses that were there. Whenever I give a presentation, I always show the Cherry Island Rear Lighthouse, because this was the first lighthouse that I ever saw in my life. I'm from Indiana, in the middle of the country. I had never seen a lighthouse. And if I had thought of lighthouses, I certainly would not have thought of this little thing. But nevertheless, I was driving down the highway. I was working as a reporter for my very first newspaper job, and driving down the highway, going to an assignment. And I saw this light just shining across the hillside and across the highway and across the railroad tracks and down onto the river. And I almost crashed my car watching it and trying to figure out what it was. Well, it turns out it was the Cherry Island rear lighthouse. And it's this lighthouse that really started me in my interest in the technology and the architecture and the development and contributions of lighthouses in Delaware. The Cherry Island Range is still an active aid to navigation. None of the original structures are left any longer. Everything is in private ownership except the lights that are maintained by the Coast Guard. This is the front range light for Cherry Island. This is the light right here. This is a bell house down here. The bells had to be protected because they suffered from the salt water more than the lights did. If you're into lighthouse tenders, this is the tender woodbine. And you may know or not know, there is only one existing lighthouse tender left in the United States, and that is maintained as a museum ship in New York. It's the Iris. Marcus Hook is the first range that ships encounter when they're coming into Delaware, the state of Delaware, from Philadelphia. It's quite an impressive building, also sitting up on the hill. It is the highest light in the state at 200 and some feet. And because I don't have my notes, I don't remember exactly how many feet, 200 and something feet high. It isn't, however, the tallest lighthouse structure. We'll see that later. It's just the light at the highest plane, but not in the highest or the tallest building. This building was quite elaborate inside. It had a map room, a chart room, I guess you should call it. It had a radio room. It had a library. I climbed it once many, many years ago. It was like being in a tiny little city inside this building. Here's what that looks like now. It has a new light in it, which is quite powerful and quite impressive. It's still an active aid to navigation, but again, the structure was sold to a private owner. So although the light is maintained by the Coast Guard, the structure is not. I want to talk a little bit now about some interesting materials and techniques that were used in building lighthouses in Delaware. In the days when most of the lighthouse development was going on in Delaware, fortunately, the authorities in this area were paying a lot of attention to the construction of bridges and tunnels instead of the construction of lighthouses because of the necessity of seating lighthouses in difficult at-sea situations in the Delaware River. They didn't have solid substrate on which to locate their lighthouses. So they were looking for all sorts of other techniques that would make the foundations sturdy and long standing. The Liston Range Lighthouse is the first lighthouse that you see coming into the Delaware River if you're coming up from the ocean. It has a lot of distinctions. It is the longest range in the United States. For a while, it had the most powerful light in the world. And it has another really kind of funky little distinction in that it's made out of wrought iron instead of cast iron. We all think of wrought iron as something that we make ornamental fences, and that pretty finial on top of the Newcastle Range Lighthouse is wrought iron, and lots of decorative things are made out of wrought iron. But their decorative things are made out of wrought iron because people wanted them to last, and because wrought iron is much more malleable and easy to work with. So somebody had the bright idea to try making a lighthouse out of wrought iron. And as far as I know, this is the only one that was ever actually completed. So this lighthouse is a good example of the use of innovative materials. It's also a beautiful example of the tension rods that are used in the construction of these tall towers like this. You get a good picture of the size of these tension rods here, and this wrought iron. These lighthouses were built in the iron works. This happened to be in Buffalo, New York. And then by contract, the government required that they be put together on site at the ironworks. The government came and inspected them there. And if they were satisfied, they gave it the okay. If they weren't satisfied, they got changes made or things fixed. And then the lighthouse was disassembled and crated up and moved to wherever it was going to be reassembled, and there it was set up again and put into work. I have a picture of one of the bolts here, and this bolt is the size of your fist. It's a massive thing. This whole structure is like a giant erector set that can be put up and taken down and put up and taken down. This lighthouse was originally sent to the Port Penn range, where it served for about 40 years. And then because the Corps of Engineers had changed the channel in the river, they had dredged a new channel, that range was no longer needed. And so they took the lighthouse apart and brought it to put it on the new range, which became known as the Liston range. So this lighthouse has actually been built 3 times and taken apart twice. And here it is still standing in 2021, having first been erected in 1897. The other beautiful thing about this lighthouse is the magnificent second order Fresnel lens that's inside it, and a equally magnificent Fresnel lens reflector. So the purpose of this is pretty unique, this reflector. There's also one in the Staten Island Lighthouse, and those are the only 2 that I know of any place in the United States. The purpose of this reflector is to capture any of the light that's going backwards from the light source, and instead of just having a wall or something shiny to, like a mirror, which has been used in the past. This is a set of Fresnel prisms so that they can not only capture the light, but refract it, bend it, magnify it, and send it back through the huge bullseye on this lighthouse. The original light source in here was oil lamps, but as soon as electricity came on, it switched to an electric power. By this time, we have this is a 1,000-watt bulb. It's about maybe 5 inches big. And it's sitting in an automatic changer so that when one bulb burns out, it just clicks around and brings the other bulb into use. No keeper required to do the job. And yes, this is me sitting in that light, behind that lens. I put this picture in so that you get a feel for how big this lens really is. It's quite magnificent. And when you're up there, the sun, during the day, of course, the sun is coming into the lighthouse, and there are just little rainbows all over the inside of this lighthouse. It's quite exciting. Liston Rear is still an active aid to navigation. It, however, has been sold to a private owner and is no longer available to the public in any way. Funny story about this lighthouse. In the early 1940s, there was a terrible storm that came through the area, and for most of the lights were either put out or you couldn't see them because of the fog, and the government ordered the Liston Range rear light, being the most powerful light in the Delaware River. It had a 5 million candle power light that could be seen for, well, some people, it's been reported to have been seen 15 miles down the river. There's good reason to believe that report may not be true, but that's what people thought about how powerful this light really was at that time. So the federal government ordered this light to be turned on and left on 24 hours a day so that it could be seen through the storm and all the clouds and fog until further notice. The notice to the keepers said to illuminate it 24 hours a day until further notice. Further notice has never come. The light is still burning 24 hours a day. This is the front range lighthouse for Liston Range. Pretty little Victorian structure. The light was shown originally up here inside this window. As you can see, this actually is not the current structure. There's yet a third structure that's now over here. The interesting thing about this light was the way they made it flash. It had a fourth order range lens that just sat on a table inside the cupola. And it had this contraption in front of it, which is sort of like a Venetian blinds laid sideways. So that it's a set of louvers in a frame that are powered by a clockwork that has to be wound just like a grandfather clock would be wound. So if you wanted the flash, the louvers were open. When you wanted the dark, the louvers were closed. So open flash, closed, no flash. And that's the way that lighthouse sent its signal out to the Delaware River. There are 4 of these lighthouses in Delaware that have a history of moving. We think of moving when you think of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse and some of the lighthouses that have moved in the last 20 years or so. You think of that as a really modern technology, but we have 4 here in Delaware that were moving around back in the 1800s and early 1900s. The Liston Lighthouse that we're talking about now moved from Port Penn. I mentioned the Cape Henlopen beacon that was built to stand duty for a couple of years before the Harbor of Refuge light replaced the Cape Henlopen light. It moved to the Mispillion River light and became the beacon there. The Delaware Breakwater had a range on for it, and its rear light, when it went out of service in the Breakwater range, was moved as far as Gasparilla, Florida, where it has a really active lighthouse preservation group taking care of it. It's in really good shape. You can climb it if you want to on certain times, if you get the opportunity. I'd highly recommend that. The view from up top is really spectacular. And the Reedy Island Lighthouse was also, although it's not much of a structure, it also was a moving lighthouse and moved to Baker Range in the Delaware River. One of the most fantastical developments in lighthouse construction happened at the 14-foot bank lighthouse. And this lighthouse was the first lighthouse in the United States, some say the world because it was successful and other tries were not, that was built using a pneumatic caisson. Okay, here's how that went. This large caisson, this whole structure, is precast iron plates that have been bolted together on shore, and then it's floated down to where it's going. This is sitting in about 75 feet of water, which has, it's kind of an area known as having no bottom, meaning that it is really, really soft, mucky sand, and there just was no way to sit anything solidly on it. So they tipped this caisson off of the barge and sunk it down as far as they could. And got it sort of sitting there, braced it with some rock, and then in the bottom of it is this wooden, this is the pneumatic caisson part. It's a wooden box that has 3 sides, top, 2 sides and a top, and no bottom. And it's like a plunger that is down now on that soft, mucky bottom. And workers enter an airlock at the top of the caisson, climb their way all the way down to the bottom. And as you see in this graphic here, by hand, shovel the dirt out through some airlocks that were in the side here, kind of right here, sinking the caisson down farther and farther into the muck and the mud until it finally hit rock and sat sturdy. At that point, they filled it with concrete up to so that it sat with just a little bit above the high water mark, and they built more caisson on top of it. They added several more rows of iron plates. Finally, they put a floor on it and they built the lighthouse.
Wow.
Quite an operation. These guys down here worked 12-hour shifts, 12 on, 12 off, 24 hours a day. The operation went on. It took 2 years to build. And I kind of think of, I think of coal miners as having a really gruesome, awful job, but this probably would be even worse. It's not only underground, but it's also underwater. So it had to have been a really scary job. Several other caisson lighthouses are built in the United States, but none of them were built using this pneumatic method. It was very successful. Here's the lighthouse still standing. It's still out there today. It was sold to a private owner in 2000. The light is still an active aid to navigation. The owner who bought this lighthouse said he was going to make a brewery, and he was going to make Delaware Bay beer out of Delaware Bay water. I don't think he generated any enthusiasm for his idea, and nothing has ever happened. As I know, this light looks just about like this, which is a picture I took while it was being offered for sale. The other interesting thing about that lighthouse is, although it took 2 years to build, and it sounds like a really massive undertaking, the contractor returned $50,000 to the US Treasury. The Treasury had allocated $275,000 to build that lighthouse, and they had money left over that they returned to the government.
Wow.
You wouldn't find that happening these days. They'd find a way to spend that money. These are the other lighthouses in the Delaware Bay Channel. They're all caisson lighthouses. None of them were built using the pneumatic method because they're all sitting on in water on which they could build artificial islands, or there was rock, bedrock very close to the surface. So they didn't have the challenges that the 14-foot lighthouse had. In the early 1800s, the federal government was allocating lots of funds to build lighthouses at the entryway to the tributaries to bays and major waterways. Delaware had no tributaries, no rivers except the Delaware River, but we did have these little creeks, and they were active creeks. They were fishing creeks. They had an oyster industry. They had a menhaden business. They had all kinds of fishing interests, and there were towns up those little creeks that needed supplies that they got by shipping interest. So these people on these creeks wanted lighthouses, and the federal government said, sorry, we're only putting lighthouses on the river. Now, the Delaware legislature is nothing if not innovative, and they have a great imagination. So they called themselves into session, and with the stroke of a pen, they turned all these creeks into rivers. So the Mayhem River, the Mayhem Creek, the Mispillion Creek, the Christiana Creek, and Smyrna Creek, now Duck Creek, all became rivers, and they reapplied for money and got lighthouses built on all of these little creeks. But these creeks had the same kinds of problems that the 14-foot lighthouse did, in that they are in the marshes, and it's soft mud. And when you build something there and it gets beat up by the storms and the waves and the shifting sands of the Delaware, they don't last very long. So as you can see here at the Mayhem River Lighthouse, there were 4 lighthouses over the course of about 70 years. This one being a picture of the very last one that was built. These lighthouses were considered really desirable duty stations by the Lighthouse Corps, because they were close to little towns. The kids could go to local schools, and mom could go in town for shopping. People could come out and visit. They were kind of almost not resorts, but certainly getaways almost. So this Port Mayhem Lighthouse has a funny distinction. The people at the Delaware Archives tell me that this particular picture is the most requested photograph in their photo collection, because so many people are still living that can remember going out to that lighthouse and visiting with the keepers and enjoying it. So it's been quite popular. Even after it was discontinued, it was still a popular spot for painters and picnics and things like that. However, in 1984, just a few days after Christmas, it was burnt to the ground. Well, burnt to the water. It was sitting in the water by that time. It had not been an active lighthouse for since the 1950s. So it had just kind of sat there, decaying and falling into disrepair. The fire department, or the fire examiner's office, ruled this an arson, but nobody was ever arrested, and there's nothing left of it today except this most wonderful example of screw piles. The Mayhem River Lighthouse was one of the first screw pile lighthouses built. And if that doesn't prove that screw piles are a good way to get a solid foundation in a sandy bottom, I don't know what does, because this lighthouse was built in the 1907 or something like that. And here we are in 2010. So 100 years, those screw piles have been standing, and look how straight they are and how level they still are. The screw pile is just like a giant auger, or like the word says, screw, that's twisted down into the soft sandy bottom, and then a platform is built across the top of them, and whatever kind of lighthouse they want is put on top of that. This type of foundation for lighthouses was so successful in the Delaware Bay that a bunch of them were then built in the Chesapeake Bay and all over the South. Any place there is a delta or a sandy river environment, screw pile lighthouses have been used. According to the federal government and the state of Delaware, these are the 13 existing historic lighthouse structures in Delaware. So each of these has, for one reason or another, has some kind of historic designation, either federal or state. But as I said earlier, that designation doesn't come with any kind of money for protection or any kind of oversight that assures that any sort of protection or adherence to preservation covenants in the deed are followed. So are quickly, with the exception of probably Delaware Breakwater, Fenwick Island, and Harbor of Refuge to some extent, they're quickly deteriorating and it's easy to see these days that it's sunset for the lighthouses in Delaware. So that's it. I probably left some things out that I should have said, but I hope I've given you an idea of the types of things that went on in the Delaware lighthouses and the kind of technologies that were used that were not normally thought of as lighthouses, and that the structures don't always look like these beautiful, graceful fingers of light. The range lights, ugly as some of them may be, were the workhorses of the Delaware. And even though now those ranges are slowly being discontinued by the Coast Guard because of GPS and all sorts of new navigational techniques, the only users really are fishermen and recreational boaters. But the Coast Guard's having a little bit of trouble doing that because people have a nostalgic affection and attachment to some of these structures. And I hope that will result in the preservation of some of them rather than just letting them disappear from the face of the earth. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody might have. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening. And I hope when you see lighthouses in the future, you'll think beyond how pretty they are to how challenging it might have been to solve the problems that needed to be solved by that light.
Hey, thank you, Judith. That was great.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Judith. That was great.
Thanks, Susie.